The war with Iran is only moving into its next phase, which is way more dangerous, because the IDF is on immediate alert for the possibility of a return to war with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in Iran's Revolutionary Guards, they are convinced that the United States has more to lose than they do. 2 tankers pulled back from Hormuz at the last moment just today, filled with oil, and Iran is once again threatening the passage and announcing that the strait is closed. Are we on the way to a naval siege? Donald Trump reveals a huge clue after the failure of the negotiations with Iran about what the future holds. In Jerusalem and in Washington, they see eye to eye on the red lines in the negotiations between the United States and Iran. In Jerusalem, we're not surprised, and we're expressing satisfaction that the Americans adopted the approach that it is better to avoid an agreement than to sign a bad agreement. The ball is in Trump's court. And in Israel, they are preparing for a return to war following the collapse of the talks, and the IDF is raising its alert levels, and the question is being asked, will the chief of staff surprise Iran once again? And meanwhile, on Israel's northern border, the war against the Hezbollah terrorist organization in Lebanon is intensifying. So to everyone who has already declared victory or failure in the campaign against Iran, I suggest drinking a glass of cold water, because we are not at the end, maybe only at the beginning of another phase. And right now, as I'm talking to you, you can hear behind me a helicopter, a military chopper that is on his way to some operation in this area. The war is not over. And right now, Iran is betting all its cards against the threat from the United States. After the negotiations ended without an agreement, J.D. Vance got up and left. And in our neighborhood, the Middle East, that means that the timer for a return to fighting has already started to run. I'm Yair Pinto, with me is Mati Shoshani, and we are boots on the ground, and we bring you the whole truth about what's happening in Israel, and also the whole truth about what's happening in our neighborhood, the Middle East. And this is the opening of day 44 of the war, Roaring Lion, or by its American name, Epic Fury. The United States put a take-it-or-leave-it proposal before the Iranians and hoped that they would surrender. But Iran became stubborn, and Pakistani sources claim that the sides did not agree on several issues, including the nuclear issue and the front in Lebanon against the Hezbollah terrorists. And also, not to mention that Iran was not willing to discuss the missile issue at all. A diplomatic source familiar with the talks said that the talks began with a handshake between Kalibaf, the head of the Iranian delegation, and J.D. Vance, the vice president of the United States, along with refreshments that included teapots, cookies, and fruit to create a good atmosphere. But quite quickly, the trend changed completely. Accusations were raised, mainly from Iran against Witkoff and against Kushner, who conducted the negotiations before the two wars. Kushner and Witkoff responded sharply, and at a certain point, when the tone rose to shouting, the Pakistanis intervened and sent the delegations out for a break. After that, we all know what happened. The talks continued with uncompromised demands from the Iranians, followed by the vice president's declaration that there is no deal, and the return of the American negotiating team back to Washington. The reactions in Washington and in the countries of the region to the collapse of the talks in Pakistan ranged from a scenario that was known in advance to surprise in light of the hardline positions that were presented by Iran. In general, most officials placed the blame on Iran and assessed that the Revolutionary Guards dictated rigid positions despite Iran's vulnerable condition and the blows that it had suffered. It is important for me to explain something to you as well, as a person living here in the Middle East, in Israel. As I call it, this is the toughest neighborhood in the world. And for anyone in the Middle East, the reports of the collapse of the talks should not surprise anybody. The Iranians have a 4,000-year-old negotiation culture. They are a culture of merchants, of the bazaar inside the room. The Iranians project superiority. They feel free enough to blow up the talks on the assumption that the Americans, under pressure from the deadlock, will try to soften them with another concession to bring them back to the table. Today, the Iranian oil ministry issued an ambitious statement saying that the country is working to restore most of its refining capacities within just 60 days following the heavy damage caused to its strategic infrastructure in the recent attacks. In Tehran, they are trying to calm the internal markets and international customers by claiming that engineering teams are working around the clock to repair the refineries that were hit. And in the meantime, Saudi Arabia has recovered from the Iranian strikes. Saudi Arabia announced that its energy infrastructure and main oil pipeline have returned to operation after Iranian attacks, after those attacks caused a loss of about 700,000 barrels per day in pumping capacity. The special envoy of US President Donald Trump, Steve Witkoff, in light of the reports suggesting that something may have happened to them. We note that Jared Kushner and the American technical team left Pakistan after the end of the negotiating team with Iran. And they clarified that all members of the delegation left Islamabad. This is contrary to reports on Arab channels that Witkoff and Kushner remained in Pakistan. As was reported by an anonymous source that all the media channels quoted, therefore, we are here to bring you everything that's happened in these negotiations against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Because in Israel's defense establishment, they estimate that the President of the United States holds a significant card in case the negotiations with Iran collapse. It apparently involves the imposition of a broad American naval siege that will almost completely block the movement of ships to and from the country. By directive of the Israeli Chief of Staff, the IDF is on immediate alert for the possibility of a return to fighting with Iran. The Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, instructed the IDF to move to a heightened alert posture following the collapse of the talks between the United States and Iran, and to prepare for the possibility of a return to military confrontation within a short time frame. According to military sources, the IDF entered an orderly battle procedure, similar to the format activated on the eve of previous operations, like Orion or Lion's Roar, while accelerating all planning and execution processes. As part of the procedure, an instruction was given to preserve high readiness across all formations, alongside shortening the response times and closing operational gaps. Israeli Air Force fighter jets eliminated Hezbollah's mouthpiece in the Lebanese media. The IDF eliminated the journalist Ali Shuhib, who had been a terrorist in Hezbollah's Radwan force and operated for years under the cover of a journalist. In Lebanon, they are preparing for negotiations with Israel that are tearing the country apart even before they have even begun. And the IDF continues to encircle the Shiite village under the control of the Hezbollah terrorist organization at this very moment. The IDF is attacking with dozens of heavy munitions. The Air Force is bombing Binjbel in southern Lebanon with dozens of heavy munitions and is part of the battle to defeat the town, which has been a Hezbollah symbol since the Second Lebanon War. The instruction given to the IDF forces surrounding the town in recent days is to act from a distance with many munitions and to take advantage of the Army's technological superiority. And right now, before we begin, are England and the United States entering a Cold War? For decades, Diego Garcia Island served as the most important strategic asset to the United States in the Indian Ocean, but a dramatic British decision to hand over sovereignty over it to Mauritius has sparked a confrontation with the Trump administration. Right now, President Trump is threatening to cancel the agreements and impose sanctions on London out of concern that the move will allow China to establish a military outpost right next to the American aircraft. I'm Yair Pinto, and with me is Mati Shoshani, and we are boots on the ground, and we bring you the whole truth about what's happening in Israel. And this is day 44 of the war against the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, which is the head of the axis of evil in the Middle East. And 1 second before we begin, I want to call on all of you to keep spreading the truth. Share our content with as many people as possible. Click on the subscribe button. Most importantly, do not forget to look for me, Yair Pinto, and for Mati Shoshani on our social media platforms to get an eye-level, behind-the-scenes view of what it's like to live in Israel under this war. Our senior Middle East correspondent, Mati Shoshani. How are you doing, first of all? Can you hear me?
I'm doing well, Yair. I can hear you. I can see you. All technical things are working. We're already doing well.
We need to make some mistakes in order to prove that, we're coming to them in one shot.
Here, I'll disconnect the camera so we can...
So, Mati, tell me, from the very beginning, the message of the Trump administration to the Iranians was very sharp and clear. Either we hit you or you sit down and sign an agreement. So what's happening in the talks now, and where are we heading towards?
Well, at the moment, there are no talks. The U.S. has done the right thing, the smart thing, and walked away from a, let's call it an adversary or a partner for negotiations, depending on how you want to look at the Iranians right now. Looked at them and said, look, you guys are not serious. You didn't come to sign a deal. You didn't come to negotiate. There is no goodwill here. We'll see you when you're ready to talk. And the U.S. envoys, Witkoff, Kushner, and VP Vance, they all just got up and left, as they should have and as they said they would. The Iranians came to these negotiations with very little or no intent of actually negotiating in good favor. Right now, we're in a position where we don't know exactly where things are going. But the biggest headline right now is not only will there be negotiations the day after tomorrow, maybe, or later in the week, but will President Trump put a blockade on Iran now? And let me just read you, let me pull this up over here. Let me read you the statement from President Trump, which is like the headline of the last 4 hours, since there's been a lot of headlines, a lot of headlines today. President Trump says, the United States Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. That is the headline right now. That is the news that we're exposed to right now. And that shows you that the U.S. is playing a different game. I think this is good news for everyone involved. They're not playing to the tune of the Iranians that love playing these negotiation games, as you said a couple minutes ago, going back and forth. Oh, we didn't mean to insult you. Oh, we didn't mean to, to ignore everything you said throughout the negotiation until the last minute. The U.S. is playing a strategic negotiation game, and thank God for that. Instead of letting the Iranians drag out these negotiations for 2 weeks, they're clearly saying from the beginning, look, if you want to negotiate, these are the terms for the negotiation. Get rid of your nuclear facilities and enriched uranium. Stop with the ballistic missiles. Stop being the global terrorist that you are. Very basic request when you're trying to end a war against the country. And all you need to do in return is open the Strait of Hormuz. They didn't open the Strait of Hormuz. And we've talked about this a lot, Yael. This is the important part. What Trump is saying now has been on the table from the first moment of this war. And President Trump, and you could criticize this step, or you could understand where he's coming from, up to this moment, didn't block Iranian trade and Iranian oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you might say there was a complete stoppage of shipping and oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz. That would not be the case. There was no shipments coming out of the Gulf states, or for the most part, that too is a bit nuanced. No Israeli, no American-related shipments, but the Iranians were moving oil. And now Trump is pushing the big red button that affects the Iranians and saying, I will cut off your economy. And the way to do that is to prevent you from moving your shadow fleet of oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz time and time again. That's the big headline that's happening right now. And that shows you, and I think shows everyone in the world, that the American administration came to this negotiation after doing their homework. They understood who they're standing against, the Iranian regime, how dirty they're willing to play in these negotiations, and they came with their own toolkit to it. I think it's brilliant. The fact that they got on a plane and said, we're done for today. You guys don't mean business. This is a joke. We'll be back when you're ready to behave like adults. Got on a plane and left, and then made a point of saying, we're not actually leaving anyone behind. There is no contingency team. There is no one waiting for you when you decide to behave well. We're done, and you better get your act together, or bad things are coming your way. And then Trump almost immediately says, we tried. Just think about the time. This is early morning hours for Trump, 8 a.m., give or take, Eastern time in the US. Trump's already releasing messaging to the global audience saying the Iranians had all the chances. We really, really tried. And they intentionally, this is not a mistake, they intentionally jeopardized and sabotaged the negotiations. And what we're going to do in return, we're going to hit them where it hurts, in their pocket. I think this shows a lot of wisdom on the US side. What do you think about that, Yael?
Yeah, Mati, I think it's really nice to see that somebody's standing up to the Iranians, because for many, many years, they were like the top level negotiators of the world, and they got whatever they wanted. So it's really nice to see that actually they are now putting in their place. But I'm actually curious, Mati, about how in practice do the Iranians close the Strait of Hormuz? Is that just with a threat, or actually there are mines there in the strait and people are afraid to go through there? So like, how can you close the Strait of Hormuz? It's a pretty big, narrow water pathway, like what, a few miles or dozens of
it's 20 to 30
kilometers,
kilometers,
something like that. Yeah.
20 to 30 kilometers in its narrowest point. But if you think about the size of these ships, Yael, these ships are the length of 3 football fields. They're hundreds of meters long, these oil tankers. They're moving at the speed of a light jog. That's how fast they're moving through the water. They're the size of a multiple-story building painted in red or blue or something like that. It's not that hard to hit them. And this might, in let's call it in land terms, 20 to 30 miles might sound like a lot. But if you have a surface-to-sea missile, and the Iranians do, they have both purchase systems and homemade systems, as in missiles that they've been manufacturing over the years. Hitting a sea target or naval target that's that big and moving that slowly without any decoy measures is not very hard. Even the most rudimentary type of missile would be able to hit something like that. So that's something to take into account. But it's mainly the threat, to answer your question. You don't really have to lay mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Think about this, Yael. Say, you can drive your car, but all I can say is that somewhere between your driveway and the exit of your neighborhood, I've planted a bunch of mines under the road. Now, I can't tell you where they are, but you're free to drive. Well, that doesn't really mean you're free to drive. So even if they didn't plant mines, and I imagine they did plant some mines, just the mere fact or the threat or the hint at we think there might be mines, and we're not really sure where they are, you might want to reconsider. Maybe you should call our hotline and see if we can collect a payment to make sure we get you the right coordinates of how to travel through the Strait of Hormuz. So they've done that. And 2, they've threatened ships. And we've seen over the days, I have on my workstation over here, I have a live tracker that someone beautifully built. It's called Hormuz Strait Monitor, by the way, which essentially tracks the movement of ships through the Strait of Hormuz on a regular basis.
So how many ships do we have moving now? How many ships moved
in the last 24 hours? And here's the important link. There's 7 in the last 24 hours that have their transponder on. Why do I say that? Because what's been happening in the Strait of Hormuz is I think most days it's 4 to 5 to 6 ships that have a transponder on, and then about double that number, let's say another 10 ships that have no transponder on. Who are those? Our good friends of the Shadow Fleet, the Iranian ships, these old oil tankers that travel on some kind of flag one day and another flag another day. They don't have any transponders on, which is sort of the basic rules of traveling the high seas, is sort of having a locator so you don't crash into another ship. They don't bother doing that, unsurprisingly. And what they've been doing is moving oil in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. And here's the important part, Yael. The US, just like the Iranians, can, just like that, at the mention of the threat of stopping a ship, they can prevent Iranian ships from leaving. And they don't even have to sink the ships. That's how sophisticated the technology is. They can just say to the Iranians, we're not going to allow your ships to leave with oil. And if the Iranians test them, all they need to do, take small rocket, small torpedo, aim it, small explosive charge, put it on the rudder, put it on the, some kind of technological component on the ship, and just paralyze it in the water and allow it to sort of drift along showing everyone else what happens if you try to leave. So it doesn't take much to block that narrow of a strait. Again, 20 to 30 kilometers, or miles, depending on where you're looking. It's not that small, but when you're a huge ship moving slowly, and on both sides, you have maybe the U.S. Let's call it a Navy on one side, and the Iranians with their missiles and their speedboats with the rockets, they're on the other side. It's not very hard to stop the ships. And the important note to make here is that the straits are closed. They are not open. Ships cannot travel. Global trade has not continued. The price of oil has not gone down. It continues to go up. And really the question in everyone's mind now, Yael, is what happens next? I mean, it feels like we went from things are going great over the weekend to a day later, there's a threat of a naval blockade over Iran. What are your thoughts? Where do you think this is going?
Well, I think that the Iranians are gonna respond with making more threats and potentially launching some kind of small attacks against the Gulf states, but not directly at the American assets, and then try to get back into the negotiations table, because basically they have to. And what I hope will happen is that the United States will actually act on their threats and create this siege surrounding Iran, bringing in more forces and basically either resuming the fighting and continuing to strike the head of the Ayatollah regime, while at the same time, hopefully this is happening behind the scenes, I don't know, arming the Iranian opposition groups, the Kurds, or other Iranians that have been attacked by the besieged forces on the ground, and starting to push forward to completely topple this regime. So this is what I hope will happen, and a little bit of what I think will happen, which is the Iranians will launch attacks through their proxies, will launch attacks against the Gulf states, either directly or through proxies, and try to get the Americans to get back into the negotiations table, with the goal of unfreezing around $100 billion from frozen assets that are Iranian, but the Americans froze them as part of the sanctions against the Ayatollah regime. So we'll see what happens. Not sure so much. Every day will let us know. What can you add?
I can add that there's another big problem here, which is Trump or the U.S. putting a blockade on the Iranians doesn't solve our financial issue. That's really the big issue here, which is what does it do? It puts pressure on the Iranians. But if you think of the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz makes this sort of like reverse C-shape movement, and it funnels this entire Iranian, Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf, whatever you want to call it. It funnels it downwards through the Strait of Hormuz and then
the Trump Gulf. I think you meant that the Trump Gulf.
The second U.S. Gulf, the Trump Gulf. He can call it whatever he wants. Anyway, the point is that if you're blockading that area, the Iranians can still damage any other ship that's trying to leave. So if you're the Emiratis or the Saudis or the Qataris or the Kuwaitis or the Omanis, the list goes on, any one of those countries that wants to move oil through the strait, before they get to the American blockade that will definitely let them through, they have to go by the coastal waters of Iran, where they have these little speedboats that they've built, a whole fleet of them, huge fleet, with rockets and missiles and machine guns and RPGs. It doesn't take much, just think about it. Think of a quick assault team that has a speedboat, speedboats can be pretty big. 30-foot speedboat has 8, 10, 12, terrorists on it. They have their missiles, they have their RPGs, they have their heavy machine guns. That in itself is enough to scare away any big ship that's trying to come down those straits. So it's a really complicated situation where the blockade itself doesn't actually stop the Iranians from causing damage. What it does is it applies more pressure to Iran. And then it's a question that relates to what you were mentioning, the money question of how much money do the Iranians have? How hard does it hurt them when the squeeze is put on them? When perhaps, and this is something that's been threatened, when the UAE starts freezing their assets within the country, their shadow companies, their shadow, shell corporations, etc. When they start freezing those assets, how much does that hurt the Iranian regime? And what's the timeline on that? Like, what if it takes them 60 days or 90 days to even run out of, of available cash? That's a whole lot of time, Yael. And then we'll be, 3, 4, 5 months into no trade of oil coming out of that area, aside from one little pipeline from Saudi to the western side of that peninsula, which is not enough. So, really tricky waters to navigate over here. I hope
exactly.
That I hope the Trump administration keeps moving at this pace. In other words, we were talking about this in previous broadcasts. The worst case scenario from our perspective is the Iranians get to drag this out, 2 weeks of back and forth, at the end of which we're exactly in the same position, yet now everyone's tired and the global economy's taken even more of a hit. What Trump and his team are doing now, it indicates they've figured out the Iranians to a better degree. They're going after them in a faster pace. They're putting the squeeze on them. They're not letting them waste time. And by doing that, I don't want to say they can guarantee, but they can make sure that the Iranians are forced into a more tight timeline. As in, if you play dirty, the negotiation's over. We'll see you in 3 days. We'll see you in 5 days. We'll see you in 7 days. And if you don't do this, there's military retribution for that every single time. We'll come after your assets. We'll block your ships. We'll put the pain on you, so this doesn't feel like this effortless, cruising down the Strait of Hormuz while we wait for the ceasefire to end.
Mati, you know what I hope that will happen also here in this situation? I hope that the Gulf states, let's say Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, will start to do something about this blockade. Will use their military or their influence in order to pressure the Iranians as well. This shouldn't be just a US-Israel effort to release the Strait of Hormuz. So I hope that on the one side, a military action will be taken by the Gulf states, because they've been threatening that they want to do this for a long time. So I hope that they will actually act on these threats. That's one. And then second, I hope that an alternative, like a long-term alternative, will be started to be formulated, such as another pipeline that will bring oil maybe towards Israel or maybe towards Saudi Arabia, plus a land pathway, a corridor that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. And then we won't see ourselves in the same situation 5 years, 10 years from now, if this war will be actually resolved now.
Can I add some thoughts here, Yael? Let me see if I can. I know we're live, so I don't think I can pull up my screen. I need people to bear with me for 1 minute. What you're talking about, this is long term. It's obviously not relevant for the next 5, 6, 7 years. But long term, the biggest financial battle that's taking place in the Middle East is exactly in the lines of what you were discussing. And there's this idea of a route. Let's call it the circumventing the Iranians route, going around the neighborhood bully route. And there's two options. One is the Israeli-friendly one, and one is the Turkish-friendly one. The Turkish-friendly one runs all the way on the land. So it runs, think on a map, you're going from, through, let's call the Arabian Peninsula, straight up, you cross through Syria, and you end up in Turkey. That's number one. Who does that benefit? That benefits the Turks, because now the Turkish government is sitting on the most major natural gas and petroleum pipeline in the world. We're talking, enormous sums of money that go through their backyard. Now they can put the squeeze on other countries. Now they can be the ones to say, yes, we let it through. No, we don't let it through. They'd love that.
But that's pretty dangerous. That's pretty dangerous, because you need to go through Iraq, you need to go through Syria, very unstable countries. So I don't know if you want to put your money on that. Yeah,
I wouldn't. But it's banking on the fact that there will be stability in the Middle East. And of course, it plays in Turkey's benefit, because one, they hate Israel. Their leader has this, there's no nice way to say that, almost like, madness against Israel. He starts foaming at the mouth every time you mention Israel or Netanyahu or any leader of this country. We're talking, of course, of President Erdogan, who seems to have something against us. Yeah, one or two things against us at least. But then there's another route that's being discussed, which is the direct one, but it goes through Israel. And then that one, it cuts up the Arabian Peninsula. It crosses through Israel, some of it through sea, some of it through land. Again, people might not recognize the map. And Micah, do we have a way to pull this up on the screen? No, let's not make it complicated now. Anyway, if you can imagine this, you go from Saudi to straight into Jordan and then cross over to Israel. And then through Israel, there already is an existing pipeline, by the way, that was built together with the Iranians back in the 60s. There is a pipeline that runs all the way to the coast of the Mediterranean. And then that pipe goes to our good friends and the enemies of the Turks, drumroll, the Greek. And then it goes into Europe. So when we think about the long-term solution, it's this really interesting battle of how do we avoid the Iranians? Because clearly, once they've been able to cause this level of damage, we know they're not going to stop. Anytime in the future they have a chance to do this again, they found a button that hurts other people, they're going to keep pushing it. They're a sadist government that loves inflicting pain on others. They're not going to stop. But if you can circumvent them and bring it not through an enemy country, but through Israel to Europe, suddenly become irrelevant. Have your way with the Strait of Hormuz. Do whatever you want. We'll move goods a different way. So it's a really interesting game that's playing out in front of our eyes, thinking of the day after. And one last thought on what you said, Yair. I think that question of what is Saudi Arabia going to do? What are the Gulf states going to do? I think that's fascinating here. Like, I find it bizarre that they haven't stepped in yet to do something. We keep talking about this example. Back in the good old ISIS days, I say that facetiously, of course. ISIS, they burnt a pilot that was from the Jordanian Air Force that had crashed in their controlled area. And I think it was like the son of someone in the royal family, the royal Jordanian family. And then the king and his son and like their crack troops, they loaded up to their choppers, to their jet fighters, to everything that can fly. And they bombed the ISIS bases. I mean, it's considered one of the most substantial bombing missions against ISIS in those years. And they did it to make a point, which is a very important point to make in the Middle East. You don't mess with us. And I'm so dumbfounded by the fact that we look at the Saudis and we look at the Emiratis specifically, who have a legit army. I mean, they have like expensive, trained, well-equipped with the best of the American equipment armies. By the way, also they're now buying Ukrainian anti-drone munitions and technologies, and they're not using them. And I look at that and I say, how are you not fighting to rebuild your dignity in this region? You've only been taking fire time and time again. And Yair, the only reason I can come to is that they're doing this because they're still afraid of the Iranians. They're still afraid of the Iranians. And I think this is the time for leaders. They have strong leaders. You think about MBS, MBZ. These are legit historical level leaders who know how to move their people from one place to the other. This is their time to shine. To really stand up and show the world what their people have made of, and that they're not afraid of the bully that is the Iranians. I'm waiting to see that happen. With them, I have hope. With the European countries that should be playing into this game, a little less at this point.
A lot less, I would say. Well, thank you so much, Mati Shoshani. We'll see you again tomorrow. And in the meantime, let's pray for wisdom to all these leaders that you mentioned, to have the guts and the right moves to make.
Yeah, amen to that.
Thank you very much. And to all of you that are joining us now, we are TBN Israel, and we report multiple times a day on what's happening in this region, the Middle East. We are standing in Israel, near the Jerusalem area, and we bring multiple updates on what's happening. So if you want to be updated on all the facts, all the information that is happening in this region, make sure to hit the subscribe button on TBN Israel so you never miss another update of Boots on the Ground. Now, let me tell you something that many of you did not hear. One of our partners is called Meir Panim. They are doing humanitarian aid, give food to those that need it in Israel, those poor families that have not enough food to put on the table for their children. So their branch, Meir Panim's branch in Dimona, an Israeli city in the south, was hit. And after a direct missile strike in that area, the building suffered severe structural damage and is now completely unsafe to use. What was once a place of warmth, dignity, and daily meals for those who need it is now filled with broken glass, debris, and instability. More than 470 residents were displaced in this attack, and thousands of homes were affected. And right in the middle of it, Meir Panim, which is a lifeline for so many, was deeply impacted. Inside the building, ceilings are at risk of collapse. Electrical and plumbing systems have been destroyed. Entire sections of the facility need to be rebuilt from the ground up. And yet, the meals haven't stopped. Even without a building, even in crisis, the team of Meir Panim continues to provide food every single day to those who depend on it. But emergency operations are not enough. We need to rebuild, not just to restore what was lost, but to bring this place back to life, a fully functioning, dignified space where people can once again receive meals with respect, consistency, and care. Government support may cover part of the damage, but it will not restore the heart of this place. That depends on all of us. So if you want to stand with the people of Israel in the city of Dimona that was hit directly, if you want to help rebuild this place of hope, we invite you to give today. You can visit bless-israel.org. Again, that's bless-israel.org. Be part of restoring Meir Panim in Dimona, in Israel, because together we can rebuild and support the people who need the help more than anybody else. Now let's get back to the news. Israel's chief of staff today put the IDF on immediate standby for a return to war with Iran. And at the very same time, 2 American destroyers passed through the Strait of Hormuz and began shaping the conditions for clearing naval mines, while Tehran kept projecting toughness, denying weakness, and speaking about diplomacy alongside the military struggle. So after 21 hours of talks that blew up in Pakistan, the question now is simple. Are we heading for another round of negotiations, or has the countdown to renewed fire already begun? To understand day 44 of the Roaring Lion War, or by its American name, Epic Fury, we need to begin at the point where diplomacy once again meets metal, meets sea, and meets fuel. The talks in Islamabad ended without an agreement, without a breakthrough, and without any real picture for calm. Vice President J.D. Vance returned to Washington and made it clear that the Americans had arrived with a final and simple offer, but the Iranians did not accept it. From Washington's point of view, the heart of the disrupt was the remains of the nuclear issue. From Tehran's point of view, the issues were broader: Hormuz, uranium, sanctions, war compensation, the end of the fighting, and recognition of Iran's rights. That gap was not only about content, it was also about method. The Americans wanted a take-it-or-leave-it deal. The Iranians came to the negotiations the way they approach a regional bazaar: buy time, create pressure, harden positions, and project strength even out of weakness. That is why we saw handshakes, we saw tea, hospitality, and formal courtesy on one side. But very quickly, we also saw shouting, accusations, and forces paused that the Pakistanis had to mediate. What began as a summit of cautious hope ended as a summit of raised voices. Inside the room, 3 disputed stood above all the rest. 3 things. The first was the Strait of Hormuz. Iran wants to keep real control over the most important oil route in the world. The United States is demanding stable and full access with no barriers and no payments. The second was enriched uranium. Washington demanded that the enriched stockpile be removed from Iranian soil, and Iran refused. The third was money. Tehran demanded the release of frozen assets on a massive scale, and in some versions, the number mentioned was $27 billion, while the Americans offered only a gradual process and only after a real implementation of the future agreements takes place. But in the Middle East, as you know, what does not make it into the agreement is sometimes just as important as what does. The Americans asked to separate Lebanon from the negotiations with Iran. From their point of view, Israel would deal with the Lebanese front on its own, whether through peace or through war, without turning Hezbollah into another area in this agreement in Tehran's compensation package. The Iranians, on the other hand, they wanted the exact opposite. They tried to tie everything together: Hormuz, Lebanon, the nuclear file, sanctions, and the ceasefire. The moment all the fronts are wrapped into one deal, every small concession becomes far more expensive. And that brings us to Hormuz. This is now the heart of the crisis, not only militarily, but economically and also politically. 2 American destroyers passed through the strait today, and Central Command announced that its forces had begun shaping the conditions for clearing the naval mines. This was not just another routine naval movement. It was the first time since the beginning of the war that American warships moved through there publicly and with such a clear message. The Iranians, meanwhile, they claimed that they had threatened the ships and forced them back. And based on the picture that is emerging, the truth appears more complicated. The Americans are testing the waters. The Iranians are testing the nerves. And neither side is rushing yet to fire the first shot. The story of Hormuz is no longer about who controls the passage. Iran has turned that strait into a machine of pressure. In the different versions that surfaced around the crisis, Tehran not only blocked free movement, but tried to establish a kind of new transit regime with conditions, control, and at times, even practical demands for passage fees. Here, we need to understand the significance. In the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, you pay for an artificial infrastructure. In the Strait of Hormuz, we are dealing with a natural waterway, one that under the international maritime law is supposed to remain open. So the attempt to turn it into an Iranian cash register is not only an economic move, it is a direct challenge to the international maritime order. And according to the assessments that are raised today, if Iran manages to preserve partial movement and actually collect payment for every passage, it could generate billions for itself. In some scenarios, the figures even reach tens of billions a year in traffic returns to normal levels. It sounds dramatic, but here too, there's a trap. Money from the sea will not save the Iranian economy. It will only give it air, because even if Iran squeezes billions out of the transit, it is still selling oil to China at painful discounts because of the sanctions, and still suffering from severe inflation, negative growth, heavy war damage, and a desperate need to repair damaged energy and the infrastructure. And that's where Tehran issued what sounded today almost like a desperate announcement. Iran's oil ministry said it intends to restore most of the country's refining capability within 60 days. Tehran spoke about emergency work around the clock, local engineering teams, the use of capacities developed through decades of sanctions, and a goal of returning to about 80% of original capacity by early June. It sounds like an attempt to project control, but the real meaning runs deeper. The regime understands that if the refineries do not return to work quickly, the problem will not be only oil exports. The problem will also be transport, industry, internal markets, long lines at gas stations, and perhaps a new wave of public unrest. Iran's difficulty is not only in producing oil, it is in refining, repairing, stabilizing, and restoring control systems, pressure pumps, and sensitive components that do not always exist on the local market. That is why, beneath the confident tone of the oil ministry, there is also enormous pressure. The regime is trying to buy time, not only against the outside world, but also against the Iranian public. When there is a shortage of fuel, it becomes very hard to sell the citizens the story that we won because we survived. And that's exactly where Trump feels his own pressure. For him, oil prices and fuel prices are not background noise. They are a political metric. As long as Hormuz is not open in a stable way, and as long as the global markets still feel threatened, it is hard for the White House to present victory. If Trump returns now to intense war, he risks another jump in the energy prices. If he does not return to war and leaves Hormuz half open and half threatened, then he is left with a crisis that has not truly been solved. That's the real dilemma. Not only war or agreement, but whether it is even possible to manage a long-term state of no war and no peace without paying a very heavy price. And in Israel, according to all the signs, they understand very well that the clock is moving fast. The IDF is already preparing for the possibility of an immediate renewal of fighting. Military intelligence and the Air Force are increasing the pace of the target building. In recent days, actions were taken to improve readiness, both in defense and in offense. Military officials are speaking about a high level of alert and the ability to act immediately if political instructions are given. In other words, the system is not sitting around waiting to see whether the Iranians answer politely. It is already reorganizing the folders, the intelligence, the routes, and the munitions. The chief of staff, along with other officials in the system, does not present the collapse of the talks as a technical event. On the other hand, it is not certain that this is over for good. No one is treating it as just another bureaucratic malfunction. The harsh American tone, along with the understandings that the nuclear issue and Hormuz are linked together, creates a situation in which decisions may be taken not weeks, but also in hours. And at the same time, according to the intelligence assessments that are raised today, Iran is continuing to move launchers out of tunnels that had previously been blocked by earlier airstrikes. And contrary to some earlier declarations that were heard after the first blows, Iran's missile program has not disappeared. On the contrary, according to one of the assessments, thousands of ballistic missiles are still in the hands of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. Simply, they are buried underground and waiting for the moment when they can be extracted, activated, or redistributed. This is a very important detail because it means that even if Iran has been weakened badly, it is still dangerous, still flexible, and still capable of surprising. The picture is also far from over in the nuclear arena. Iran has reinforced the Isfahan facility with barriers and fortifications in an attempt to delay any possible ground raid on its uranium stockpiles. If anyone in the West thought that this story would end only with airstrikes, these fortifications say the exact opposite. Tehran understands that the real question now is not only what was bombed, but what is still buried, what can still be extracted, and what will happen if Washington and Jerusalem decide that the time has come to physically reach the material itself. And meanwhile, Iran is still trying to project confidence. Kalibaf, the Iranian parliament speaker who led the delegation, said that America had understood Iran's positions and must now decide whether it is capable of earning Iranian trust. He thanked Pakistan, praised the negotiating teams, and stressed that Iran sees diplomacy as a legitimate tool alongside military struggle. That wording matters. He did not speak about diplomacy instead of fighting. He spoke about diplomacy alongside fighting. In other words, from Tehran's point of view, both tracks continue at the same time. And that connects directly to another message that Trump himself has projected in recent days. He wrote that Iranians do not understand that they have no cards, that they are alive only in order to negotiate, and that they are better at dealing with the fake news media and public relations than at fighting. It is a classic Trump language, but behind the style, there is also an operational line. The White House is signaling that it is buying less and less into the Iranian delay tactic, and is less willing to continue long rounds of talks only to discover that Tehran is using them as a pause for reorganization. And now, let us move to Lebanon, because what is happening there matters no less than what is happening in Pakistan. According to Lebanese security sources, Israeli forces of the IDF have closed all the main access points to Binjbel. The description there is of an almost complete encirclement with dozens upon dozens of terrorists still trapped inside a town that has once again become the center of the fighting. The forces are moving slowly, carefully, and with a great deal of air power. This is not a charge-forward operation. This is ring warfare, isolation, attrition, and controlled defeat. That detail is very important for understanding this moment. While the United States is trying to remove Lebanon from the Iran negotiation package, the ground in Lebanon is still burning. Israel may have moderated parts of its pace of the fire in certain areas, especially ahead of the diplomatic contacts, but it has not stopped. On the contrary, it is still operating, slowly but stubbornly, against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. The encirclement of Binjbel points to a method. First, you close the routes, then you choke the movement, then you add more intelligence and more air power, and only after that do you bring the ground forces deeper into the contact. That also explains why Jerusalem is not excited about the idea of rushed Lebanese arrangement. The concern is that if a political framework is accepted without actually disarming Hezbollah, Israel will lose freedom of action and remain facing the same enemy, only with more room to breathe. That is why the Lebanese issue came up again and again in the talks, even if the Americans tried to move it out of the room through the side doors. And as if there is not enough fronts already, the Gulf continues to move as well. Saudi Arabia announced today that its energy infrastructure and its main oil pipeline have returned to operation after Iranian attacks. This is the repair of the damage that had caused a loss of about 700,000 barrels per day in pumping capacity. This number matters because it shows two things at the same time. First, Iran is still capable of striking outside its own borders. Second, the states of the region are not waiting only for diplomacy. They are repairing, restoring, reorganizing, and preparing themselves for the possibility that the campaign will return. And while all of this happens, in Jerusalem, there is also a certain measure of satisfaction, not with the situation itself, but with the American line. Israel and Washington appear to be seen eye to eye on the red lines. No bad agreements, no leaving enriched uranium without a solution, and no giving Iran room to maneuver in Hormuz in exchange for temporary calm. From Israel's point of view, it is better not to have an agreement at all than to reach an agreement that gives Tehran time, money, legitimacy, and recovery. That's one of the central points of this day. If you enjoyed this report, make sure to give us a like, subscribe, and comment. You can also comment, let us know where you're watching. Why is this war important to you? Another way to see this war through our eyes is to go to Yair Pinto and to Mati Shoshani on our social media platforms. And then you can see this war behind the scenes. But even inside everything that's happening now, one question does not disappear. What does Trump do if the Iranians continue to play for time? Several options are now on the table. One is a naval blockade. Second is a return to bombing together with Israel, focused on energy infrastructure and national infrastructure. Another option is a ground operation in the Strait of Hormuz, the seizure of Karag Island, and even the possibility of removing enriched uranium by force. Every one of these options is heavy, complicated, and dangerous. But the very fact that they are being discussed seriously says everything about the depth of this crisis. Meanwhile, the Iranians are still trying to hold the rope from both ends. On the one hand, they want to return to the world as legitimate and obtain sanctions relief, unfreeze assets, renew the trade, and restore the flow of money. On the other hand, they want to keep Hormuz in their hands, keep enrichment, keep the leverage of the threat, and keep the card of disruption. Their problem is that this combination no longer works the way that it once did. The West may be slow, may be cautious, may hesitate, but it also understands now that it cannot both reopen the markets and allow the Iranian regime to turn the world's most important energy route into an armed toll booth. If you understand just how complicated the situation is, look at this number. On normal days, between 100 and 150 vessels pass through the Hormuz Strait every single day. That means that even a partial arrangement, even an interim mechanism, even a temporary technical solutions can effectively become an economic oxygen pipe for Iran if it is done on the terms favorable to Tehran. That is why in Israel, there are also those who fear the third option, not war, not a full American agreement, but a limited European or international arrangement that allows ships to pass and in the process also inject enough money into Tehran to help it recover. Day 44 is therefore ending with a double feeling. On the one hand, there is still no new order to open fire. On the other hand, nearly every part of the system has already returned to a war footing. The IDF is on high alert. The Americans are in the straits. The Iranians are fortifying their nuclear assets, holding Hormuz, and trying to restore refining capability. Hezbollah is under pressure in Lebanon. Saudi Arabia is restoring the flow, and the markets are still reacting to every movement. This is no longer just a story about failed agreements. It is a story about an entire region entering a dangerous interim phase in which every side is testing whether the other side will blink first. The problem is that in the Middle East, sometimes you do not need massive fire to bring the war back. One move at sea is enough. One decision in Washington, one missile pulled out of a tunnel, one convoy moving uranium from one place to another. And that is what makes this moment so tense, because everyone is speaking about diplomacy, but everyone is also preparing the next battlefield. And if the American offer really was the final and the best offer there is, and if Iran truly believes that the United States has more to lose, which one of them will discover first that it was wrong? In the meantime, help us spread the truth. And most importantly, unite in prayer for the situation. Pray for the Iranian people. Pray for our leaders that need to make very tough decisions, to make the wise ones, the smart decisions, the godly decisions. Pray for the children of Israel that are back to school. I'm happy about it. My wife sure is. My kids are back to school. But not all the children of Israel are back to normal, because the kids that live in the northern communities of Israel are still under constant daily missile attacks from the Hezbollah terrorist organization in Lebanon. And that's why the IDF is there, to make sure that our citizens are safe. So there's a lot to talk about, but I think the best thing that we can do is unite in prayer, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and we'll see you again tomorrow.